Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series, where today I am very excited to be able to introduce author Allegra Goodman, who is sharing her new novel, her wonderful new novel, Sam. My name is Alex Schaffner, and I am the events director for the bookstore. On behalf of the store and everyone who works here, I would like to thank you all for being a part of our community tonight. As an independent bookstore who have had our doors here in Brookline since 1961, we entirely rely on dedicated, loving, enthusiastic readers like you to come through our doors, buy our books, and generally make us a place of community. So thank you for being here. If you've not yet picked up your pre-ordered copy of Sam, that'll be at the back desk. If you'd like to buy copies of the book and you haven't already done so, we'll be selling them after the end of the Q&A, and Allegra will be up here signing at that point as well. Now, I'm so happy to be able to introduce Allegra Goodman this evening. Allegra is a novelist whose books are filled with an emotional richness that makes them stick in your heart. She has won the Massachusetts Book Award and has been a National Book Award finalist. She's the recipient of a Whiting Writers Award, the Salon Award for Fiction, and a fellowship from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Her novels include The Chalk Artist, The Cookbook Collector, and Kotterskill Falls. She has additionally written a novel for young readers and 2 short story collections. In Sam, which I finished yesterday and would like to revisit immediately, Goodman breathes life into a girl. Sam is in the 2nd grade when the story begins, and we watch her grow up, navigating the shortcomings of her family, the places where she herself doesn't line up with what people want or with what serves her, the depth of love, and the places it cannot reach. Sam's story begins in hopefulness. It is carefully constructed as a house built around a young woman who, to the reader, feels infinitely knowable. It catches the heart to watch Sam and her world be built stick by stick, object by object, from a wet sneaker at the Topsfield Fair to an African violet to surviving someone else's death. Sam climbs, and in her story is the tenacity of a climber. Moment by moment, strain by strain, her against the hardness of the world. This is a good book, and I am so pleased to invite the author to say more, because at the end of this good book, that's really what I wanted. So please welcome Allegra Goodman.
Oh, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. It's amazing to be introduced by somebody who just finished your book. I mean, what better? That's the writer's dream. Well, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I came to write Sam, introduce you to this character in this book, and then I will read just a little bit, probably about 10 minutes. And then I hope that you'll ask questions about it or about writing or whatever comes to mind. A lot of times the fashion these days is for 2 writers to come up together and one asks the other questions. Since it's just me, I will ask you to be my interlocutors tonight. I got this I color coordinated folder with this cover. And it was funny, when they designed this cover, they chose this hot pink for the title. And I thought it was really interesting. I kind of like the dissonance between her face and this hot pink color. Sam is not a very girly girl, and it's sort of, she's kind of like staring it down, like, I dare you to I dare you to put me in that. I dare you to dress me in that. So I thought that was interesting. So let me tell you how I came to write this book. As a writer, I like to explore all different subjects and voices in my work. I started out by writing short stories. Many of them were funny, satirical stories. I started pretty young. I was writing seriously in college. And I wrote these stories that ended up in my first book, Total Immersion, and my second collection, The Family Markowitz. And many of them were satirical. Many of them were about Jewish characters. Many of them were about older characters. One of my best characters was the pixelated Rose Markowitz, who's kind of elderly, and her middle-aged sons, Henry and Ed, who have a lot of angst. As a young writer, I thought old people were hilarious. I also defined old people quite broadly. I also had a different side to me. I had an elegiac side to me, and I wrote a novel called Kotterskill Falls when I was a young writer, which was my first novel. And that was really about a certain time and place of a very observant group of Jewish people who spent summers in the mountains in the Catskills. And they were kind of separatist, and they tried to sort of recreate a haven for themselves in this place. And they were the remnant of a community destroyed by the Holocaust. And so that was a very different side of my writing, and it's a very different style of book. I've written about scientists and accusations of fraud in academia in my novel Intuition, which is set in a cancer research lab in Cambridge, which is where I live. I've written about tech moguls in The Cookbook Collector, and teachers and gamers in my most recent novel, The Chalk Artist. And I've even written a dystopian novel for younger readers called The Other Side of the Island, way back. But there's sort of a through line through most of my work, and I like to play with multiple perspectives a lot. A few times I've sort of taken one point of view, like my novel Paradise Park, but I've always been interested in sort of exploring things in a panoramic way. So, even in my early stories, I would write about the father and the daughter, and so you would know what they were thinking about each other while they were fighting or whatever it was. I would write about the sister and the brother. I wouldn't just pick one. And I even had an editor at the New Yorker who told me many years ago when I was a young writer, if it's a short story, just pick one point of view and stick to it to the end, because I would have 15 points of view in a small space. But I was always a maximalist. So very much interested in that polyphony of sound and voices. Throughout all my work, though, I can say that I've always been interested in writing about people from the inside. I think that's one of the things that fiction can really do, is that unlike a play where, for example, where you only know what the person is saying, or a film where you have dialogue and maybe some visual information, when you're writing fiction, you can have the dialogue and have people talking to each other and then talk about what they're thinking, which could be the opposite of what they're saying, or qualify what they're saying. So there's sort of the spoken dialogue and unspoken dialogue of their thoughts and their emotions. And that's something that's always sort of drawn me as an artist. And I've always been interested in having the reader be privy to the inner voice or the inner emotions of characters. So when I start writing a book, the character usually comes first for me, and the voice of the book comes first to me. And when I get a new idea, it comes to me in the guise of a person. And in the case of this book, that person was a young girl named Sam. So where does Sam come from? So several years ago, I began commuting every day from Cambridge up to the North Shore, where my third son went to high school. I took him every day, and it was a reverse commute, so it wasn't too horrible, but it didn't make sense for me to drive back again to Cambridge. So I stayed up there during the school day and worked up in Beverly, Mass, which I hadn't, spent a lot of time in before. And it's funny, I always say, this book is set on the North Shore of Massachusetts. And I think the reason I say that is because I grew up on Oahu. And when we say the North Shore in Hawaii, it means something very different from the North Shore here. We had our North Shore, but it involved surfing, and it involved some other, a different kind of culture. But every morning I would end up in Beverly, rather frazzled after dropping my son off. And I parked on Washington Street and walked down the street and looked at the ocean, tried to calm down after, driving with all the trucks. And then I walked to a rented office in a Victorian building on Cabot Street, and that's where I worked. And I started wandering around Beverly during the day and, trying to get a sense of that place, which is very different from Cambridge and very different from Brookline and where we live here. While I was driving up there and back, I had 3 other children as well. I have 3 sons and a rambunctious daughter. And she was quite different from my sons. My sons were always bookish and very much readers. She wasn't interested in reading. She wasn't interested in following rules. She wasn't the kind of child who, when you turned your back, she'd still be there. When you turned around again, she'd be gone somewhere. She was a climber and a runner. An experimenter, and And she was my first daughter and my only daughter, and I started becoming interested in girlhood when I was parenting her. And I started thinking about my own childhood and about growing up as a girl when I had Miranda, our youngest child. I began thinking about when I was very, very young, and I had a thought when I was young, which is, why is it that grown-ups never run anywhere to get to from place to place? They were always walking everywhere. And I couldn't understand that. They always seemed so tired. If they were really in a hurry, they would start sort of trotting. They would sort of trot along quickly, but they wouldn't run from place to place. Like, no self-respecting kid is going to just walk along to the playground. You would run to the playground. So we always ran, and we were always like climbing over things and skipping and dancing and moving around. And I didn't know what happened to, and I remember thinking as a really small girl, what happened to these people, And as an adult, I remembered thinking that thought, and I saw it in my own kids, and I began to wonder, what happens to that energy that you have when you're really small, especially in girls? Where does it go? What happens to the rush and to the ambition and the energy that young girls feel? So I thought about writing a novel about a young girl who is not bookish, who is very much in her body and runs and climbs and races. And I decided to talk about how she grew up, but to do it from the inside, which has always been my interest, so that the reader can feel what she feels and see what she sees. And during my days in Beverly, as I was thinking about this girl, I walked along the beach, and I walked on Cabot Street, which has this YMCA from, I think the 20s or the 30s. The beauty salon, the library, the coffee shop. I should add, this isn't the part of Beverly where sort of John Updike hung out, which was Beverly Farms, where they have a magnificent library with kind of a shrine to him in it. This is North Beverly. On the other side, literally on the other side of the tracks, much more gritty place. And I watched the leaves change, and I picked my way over the snowbanks in the winter. And during those seasons, this character came to me. And I thought that her name was Sam. And I wrote in my notes, there's a girl named Sam. And that became the first line of the story of the book. When I begin this book, Sam is 7, and the language is really simple in the book. And as she grows, the language becomes more complex. And as her perspective broadens, the voice of the book subtly changes. It's because she sees more and she understands more, and her heart and her mind start opening. She sees the people around her more. So in this book, I really limited myself to one point of view. It doesn't have her mom's point of view of her. It doesn't have her father's perspective. It's all her, and except that her aperture is opening as the book develops. So, the reader, of course, knows more than she does, but the reader gets to see that process happening, which I think is a wondrous process. It's a lot like, what I really would compare it to is those time-lapse photographs of, a seed beginning to sprout or a flower beginning to open that you can see in film. And I didn't have film or images to do it with, so I did it with words. But that's the effect that I was after and that interested me. In many ways, this is a deeply personal book, and I drew upon my own experience as a girl, and also I was inspired by my daughter's childhood, but it's also not an autobiographical book. Sam's circumstances are very different from mine. I obviously grew up in a really different place on a tropical island. She's growing up, over here on the East Coast. In the genre of sort of coming of age novels, one of the things that I've noticed about many of them, and many of the great ones, is that at the end of the book, the protagonist often becomes an artist or a writer. If you think about it, some of the best ones, beautiful works like Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man is really about the beginnings of a writer. Or if you think about film, the gorgeous film Lady Bird, the protagonist at the end is really on her way when she gets to New York to becoming a filmmaker. She's sort of going to become Greta Gerwig. Or in Richard Linklater's Boyhood, which is an incredible movie where he does have a time lapse because he filmed it over many years. The boy, as we leave off at the end of the movie, is really a photographer and on his way to becoming a filmmaker. And I was interested in writing about a girl who doesn't become like an artist like me. She doesn't become a writer. She has different skills, different talents, different interests. I've always been really interested in the divergences between the author and the character. Not just drawing upon my own experience and memory, but displacing it into someone else, changing it, and expressing a different experience from my own. So there's something investigative about it, as well as expressive. So those are some of the thoughts that I had as I was beginning to write Sam, and as the book was beginning to gestate. And I'm going to just read to you for just a couple pages from the opening to give you a sense of what the voice of the book is like at the beginning. And I cut this quite a bit. If you are, you'll see if you are looking at your own copy, I've cut it for you guys because I don't want to tire you out listening to my voice. But here's the opening of the book. There is a girl, and her name is Sam. She has a mother named Courtney and a dad who is sort of around, sort of not. He lives 10 minutes away, but he's not always home. Courtney says that's the whole point. What is? Sam asks. He's never anywhere. Yes, he is. He's somewhere. Very funny, Courtney says. Sam is 7 and she never stops. She never helps either. Courtney is exhausted all the time, but it's not just Sam, it's Noah. Noah is 2 and he has a teddy named Bill. He got a plastic ark for his birthday, but he only has 1 lion and 1 zebra left. You can't teach Noah. You can't even scare him. He thinks Noah is his name. Sam climbs up inside the door jambs to get away from him. If you want to know how, just take off your shoes and socks. You have to be barefoot. Stand in the doorway to the kitchen and spread your feet as far apart as they can go. Wedge your feet into the frame. Inch 1 foot up, then the other. Inch up some more. Stop, or you'll bang your head. Just stay there. Brace your feet against the wood. Courtney says, you know what, Sam? This is getting old because Sam likes to stay up there so long. It is not cute. The day her dad comes over, Sam tackles him. Where were you? Are you back? When did you get back? Before he can answer, she wedges herself into the doorframe. Hey, monkey, her dad says. When did you learn to do that? Courtney frowns. A long time ago. He just looks up at Sam. Ready? Yes. Okay, let's go. She jumps down on him. Where? I don't know. He's teasing, but she doesn't care. He's a jet. He's a plane. He's a parachute. He holds Sam by the heels, and pennies start falling from her clothes. She is raining pennies that were never there before, but that's what happens with her dad. Stop that, says Courtney. Come on, Mitchell. Noah lifts his arms, even though Mitchell's not his dad, and calls out, me! Mitchell, stop. Sam is wobbly when Mitchell sets her down, but she recovers fast. Where? Topsfield. Yes! She picks up her pennies, then she runs to get her purse. The fair is bigger than 100 football fields. You have to park miles away and take shuttle buses. If any of you have done this with children, you remember. On the bus, Sam gets the window and Mitchell sits next to her. They are both wearing hoodies. Mitchell's is red socks. Sam's is gray but warm. The pockets in front are connected, so you can tunnel your hands inside. She is holding her money in her pocket between her hands. Her money is $9.26 folded into a calico change purse with the face of a cat. The clasp snaps shut between pointy ears. Mitchell pays admission and then he buys tickets. He and Sam stay away from the games because that's how they get you. They head straight for the rides. Not the zipper because it makes you sick. Not the Ferris wheel because it's a waste. They ride the pirate ship, the Vertigo, and the Raptor twice. You fly all over the people and the arcades and the food trucks and the kiddie roller coaster. When Sam is a velociraptor, she doesn't care about the cold. It starts drizzling, but Sam and her dad ignore it. They lick cotton candy and their tongues turn blue. They share a fried onion exploded like a flower. They gorge themselves on kettle corn. Mitchell holds the bag. Then, all at once, he sees the tower. They both see it. You have to tilt back your head to see the top. Handholds on the tower look like confetti. The idea is you strap on a rope and climb up any way you can, and if you get to the top, you ring a bell. I want to do that, Sam says. Can I do that? It's annoying because it costs extra. That's how they get you, even after you pay admission and buy tickets. Also, it looks wet. You really want to go up there? Asks Mitchell. Yeah. You think you can get to the top? Sam catches the excitement in his voice. He wants her to try. He thinks she can get up there, even though he says it's harder than it looks. They wait a long time, almost as long as it would have been for the trampoline. Sam shivers in her rain-soaked clothes. Mitchell would give her his own hoodie, but it's wet too. He says, maybe we should try something else. Sam isn't trying anything else. She's got her eyes on the wall and the people trying to reach the bell. One guy makes it, then there's a kid who gets stuck. When you can't climb anymore, the man with the other end of your rope starts bringing you down. Huddled together in line, Sam and her dad inch forward until finally one of the ropes people calls out, "Young lady!" Sam runs up the stairs to the platform where they hand you a helmet and strap ropes onto you. She's wearing a harness around her waist and between her legs. The rope is thick and long, and it will keep her safe if she slips and starts to fall. But that won't happen. She's already climbing with her right foot on the lowest foothold. The holds are big and close together, so she can climb foot over foot and hand over hand. The hard part is her shoes. They're wet and mushy. She wishes she could take them off, but it's too late. She can't get rid of them, even though they drag her down. She doesn't look. She's concentrating, inching up, one hold at a time. Her shoes are heavy and her hands are small, but she makes it up halfway, and then the hold starts spreading out. Her fingers are so cold she has to stop. She's not done. She's just catching her breath. After a minute, she feels better, but she's stiff when she reaches for the next hold and slips, heart pounding. Without the rope, she would come crashing down, but that's not what scares her. She's afraid she'll lose her turn. Then she'd have to wait in line again. She grabs a knobby yellow handhold, then a red. She's up so high she can't stop. She's beyond everybody but the lights, gold zipper lights, red striped lights from the Raptor. She is a cold monkey. Her teeth are chattering. Her arms are aching as she reaches higher and higher. She drags her feet up, and each one weighs 100 pounds. She lives for every tiny resting place. She stops wherever she can balance. Her fingers are numb, but there it is, the metal bell. She lurches up and slams her palm across its face. Ding! In glory, she glides down to the platform, where the ropes person unties her. Mitchell and a few people in line are clapping. "Look at you," the ropes guy says. Her face is streaked with dirt and rain and sweat. Her dad buys her hot mulled cider and a purple glow stick. Suddenly it's pouring. Everyone is leaving all at once, but you can't just jump in the car. You have to wait for the shuttle. The buses are so crowded there aren't any seats at all. Mitchell stands with his arms around Sam to protect her. "Crazy kid," he tells Sam as he rubs her frozen hands. And she feels grateful and powerful and famous. Thank you. So if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. Yes.
You were speaking about the cover. You have no influence on what they put on the cover?
I have influence. I have veto power, basically.
That's it.
Yeah, well, it's a dialogue. I seem to have a little more influence than I used to, but yeah. I had actually I made a couple suggestions. First of all, they had her name in lowercase letters, and I suggested the uppercase because it was big. I also suggested, it used to be a lot darker, and I suggested more light on her face, but they really liked this design, so we went with it. In the back, yes.
Piggybacking off the cover, do you think maybe it was pink because Sam could be a boy or a girl's name?
Actually, no. There were some choices. They had sort of a gold version, and they had different colors. And I sort of, pink was one of the options. I don't know if they were thinking about that. She has this kind of androgynous name. But there are girls' names, it's not completely androgynous, so yeah. Yes.
I've been an admirer of your work, by the way, for about 30 years. I
Oh.
wrote a master's thesis on Jewish American writers, and
Oh.
you're one of them, so this is a
Oh, my
big fangirl
goodness.
moment for me. But I'm interested to know how you did your research for the chalk artist, because that's a world that's so different from
Oh, yeah.
your own experience. I'm just interested to know.
Oh yeah, of course. So my last book, The Chalk Artist, it has to do. There are two kinds of research that I did for it. the main woman character, Nina, is a teacher in sort of a Teach for America type of program in public schools. And I had actually spent a whole bunch of time doing professional development at English High School here in Boston. And I spent a lot of time thinking about those classrooms and what goes on, sort of the theater of teaching. So I did sort of some participant observation, I guess, research there. And then for the gaming parts, I visited some gaming companies and talked to people who work there. I just as I did with intuition, where I went to research labs and spoke to scientists and worked, followed them around and watched them work. I did that with some of the game designers and spoke to them about that. And then I had a friend who, in my husband's department at MIT, he's a computer scientist who worked on computer vision and graphics. And I talked to him about sort of the frontiers of what is being done with computer graphics. So I did some research there. So a lot of it sort of involved talking to people and going to places and orienting myself. That said, I think a lot of, when you're a novelist, I would say most of your research really happens in your imagination. That sort of gets you started, but you have to create the world. There's a certain world building that you have to do, and that was the case in this book as well. Yes.
I haven't read this book, and please don't give any spoilers, but I'm curious how you chose the age where to start the story and finish the story.
Yeah. The age where the story starts, I think 7 is an interesting age. It's funny. I didn't think about this at the time, but when I was 7, that was when I decided to be a writer. It was an important age for me. When my daughter was 7, the rambunctious girl I talked about, she got very, very sick. And that was sort of it was an important age for her in some bad ways and some good ways. So 7, I think, is an interesting age in that sense. I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but then later I put it together and I thought, that's interesting. And then where it ends, it could have ended further on. It sort of ends when she's about 20 or 21. I won't say what is happening, but it covers those 14 years, which is a long time for a short book. And it has to do with her figuring out what she wants to do next, I guess. There's some milestones that happen there as well at that age. Henry James said sort of human relations stop nowhere. The writer has to circumscribe it. You have to have your frame at some point. And so it was experiment. When I started the book in my early drafts, I didn't know exactly when it was going to end. But as the book developed its shape, it became clearer just by her actions and what she learns, I would say. Yes.
I've also been a long time admirer of your work. I'm interested in knowing about the relationship with your daughter and any negotiating that you might have had to do, because you've been very public about this being based on your daughter.
Yeah, it's very funny. I wrote an essay about her getting sick, and I asked permission to write that essay and to publish it, and we talked about that, and she was all for it, and I wouldn't have done that but I didn't ask her permission to write a novel. I don't consider it to be a book, I would say inspired by her. She did read it, but only after I'd written it, and she was very funny about it. She's 20 years old. And she said, I think you should give me some royalties, because and I said, well, we are paying your college tuition, so I think that covers that. And she's like, because I inspired you. And she was also very flattered that it was dedicated to her. She's not, she now reads much more than she did when she was a little girl. She went through a period where I think she was partly reacting to her bookworm brothers. She was sort of like, they were always had their heads in a book. And she used to go around and say to people, I hate reading, like she would act out with that. One time I remember I couldn't get a babysitter and I had to give a talk. And she actually told the head of Penn New England that she hated books. She was like 8. And it's like, I was so proud, So she does read now, so she did read this book. And then she told me recently, my friends at college, asked me if I read all your work. And I told them only the books that are dedicated to me. So she's a character, I would say. But then when she read the book, she was like, I would say in the early parts of the book, when Sam was really little, she recognized certain aspects of herself, and then she said, "But that's not me." And that often happens when somebody sees a trait of themselves, and then they realize that the character is not about them. So there wasn't a lot of it. I don't ask permission sort of when I'm doing fiction. One of the reasons I like fiction. But she said she decided it was pretty good. She in the end, you know. Yes.
I too am a long time fan of yours. Do you write, you work typically with an editor? Does an editor have-
An editor before I write.
When you have the, at what point do you?
Oh yeah, that's like really good. Did you all hear the question? Do I work with an editor? So it's really interesting, and that's evolved over time. So I always like to write the first draft without any input from anybody. So I don't talk about my work to my friends. I don't even talk about it to my family. You know, I didn't talk about it to my daughter, which was actually helpful. My parent, you know, when I was younger, when I was like a kid, when I was first publishing stories, you know, at 18, 19, I would enjoy reading things to my parents and that kind of thing. And it was great. It was wonderful in its way. But I'm not like that anymore. And I have a different relationship with my work now and with other. So I keep it to myself, and then what happens is I will give it to my agent, and that will be the first reader. And my longtime agent didn't give me a lot of feedback. She was sort of like love it or hate it. Like she wouldn't get into the editorial nitty gritty. And then I had an editor who I worked with for many years, who was a wonderful woman at Random House named Susan Camel, who had a pretty heavy hand as an editor, and she would mark everything up in pencil with questions, and you know, she have long conversations with me, and I would do major revisions, you know, to address what she was talking about. And then she passed away right before COVID in 2019, and this is my first book with it, and my agent, who is also older, passed away very close in time. So I was sort of doubly orphaned with my first two readers gone. And this is my first book with a new agent and a new editor. So it's a totally different relationship with these people. So I used to be sort of much, much younger than my editor and my agent. They were middle-aged people when we started working together. I was in college. And then they became older ladies and I became a middle-aged person. But they were like, my agent was, I think, 30 years older than I was. And my editor was 20 years older. And now I'm working with an agent and an editor who are younger than I am. So it's a very different, you know, it's sort of less like, honey, like, you know, I'm less like their child. My new agent, unlike my old agent, is interventionist and is like an editor. And she's not sort of, I love it, or like, oh, I don't know what is wrong with it, but keep working on it. She's sort of like, I have 10 suggestions about this, you know, and she gives me detailed notes before she will even send it anywhere, to show anywhere. And my new editor has a very different style from my old editor. Although by the time she gets it, it's had quite a bit of revision. I would also say that I've become a different editor for myself, and a lot of writers might tell you this, but you have to sort of learn to edit, to revise yourself, and to get perspective and look at your own work and change it as necessary. I make lots of mistakes as I write. I go down the wrong path, and unfortunately, I'm not one of those people who can like realize my mistake in a couple pages. Sometimes I write 200 pages, and then I'm sort of like, oh, that wasn't right, and I have to take it all out. So I've become more self-critical. I rush a lot less than I used to. I would, as a younger writer, I would be willing to show my work earlier or half done, or I'd just be so excited about it. I just couldn't wait to show people, like my novel Katasko Falls or some of my, you know, early books. I would just couldn't wait. Now I'm just sort of like, I want to hold it back. I want to set it aside for a month and then come back and revise it. And I'll revise it multiple times before I even show my agent, who will then ask, you know, so lots of revision and learning to be more patient and having, I guess, higher standards for myself. And for me, one of the things that's really helped me is just not talking about it when I'm in the middle of it. But I think if you are working with an editor, which many of us do, it's really good to have a strong vision of what you want before that editor sees it. So just as strong as you can make it, as complete as you can make it, so that when they push, you can push back if necessary and say, no, actually that's not what the goal was. That's not what I meant. So there's that kind of push and pull. But it is very good to have those other voices speaking and helping. So I feel very blessed to work with two incredibly talented young women now on this book. Any other questions? Yes.
I am not a longtime fan. I believe I heard about this book on TikTok, so
That's amazing.
yeah, it was listed with other books that I tend to like, and just hearing the premise of it. So I was curious, do you feel like what you mainly read is similar to what you write?
Oh, that's a good question. I read as much as I can. When I was really young, I love 19th century novels. Like when I was a child, I was obsessed with Dickens. And I read, that the kind of thing that I loved was like David Copperfield or Great Expectations. That I was really into that stuff. And then in college, late high school and college, George Eliot became my idol, and I read a lot of, and she writes these sort of very elaborate, multi-dimensional, multi-perspectival books, which are incredible. So I was interested in the 19th century novel and not very tuned in to the contemporary stuff around me, I would say. Also, when I was in college, I was really interested in poetry. And I often tell students who are writing fiction, like, it's good to read poetry and to read plays and to go to plays and think about other genres, especially, but poetry, really thinking about that care with language and learning to closely read a poem is so helpful. And my interest in college was 17th century English poetry. And I wrote my senior thesis on Paradise Lost. So I was I was writing about this poetry and reading that kind of stuff and writing these kind of very contemporary satirical stories, which were Jewish American stories, nothing like Milton. So there was that divergence, I would say, between my reading and my writing, which was interesting to me. I then went to graduate school and studied Shakespeare and studied 18th century literature. So again, very much drawn to the past. I think that if you look at my novel, like Katasko Falls, you can see that what I love to read is reflected there, and it's to a certain extent. I love Jane Austen, I love George Eliot, I love Trollope, I love Dickens. And that book in particular, it was sort of like, not to sound grandiose, but you are grandiose when you're 22. It was like my Middlemarch up in the Catskills, and I was in love with these novels that were about whole communities and not just about one person. I think that, looking back, is what really interested me about Victorian novels, the networks of people, of characters in them. So when I was writing Katasko Falls, for example, I noticed that in Trollope novels, there's always like this set piece scene in a fox hunt. And in Jane Austen novels, there's often this scene at the ball, or at the party where a lot happens, And I thought, what is my scene for these Jewish people, these German Jews who are coming up from the city, from Washington Heights to the mountains? And I thought, it's a synagogue. And that was my fox hunt, So I was taking what I was reading and what I was learning and kind of transferring it into my own experience in the book. Then, as I got older, and then this novel is quite different. This really is a novel about one person. There is a world in the book, but it's all through her eyes. And so I would say that I'm not as obsessed with 19th century novels as I was when I was really young. And I try to read more broadly, read fiction more broadly. I've really enjoyed, for example, writers like Emma Donoghue. We were just talking about Claire Keegan, who wrote Foster. Yeah. People who are, Tess Hadley is really interesting to me. People who are writing today, I would say. I got more interested in that. So I've broadened my my interests. I think whatever you read, you can learn from, and often it's not necessarily the lessons that people might expect you to learn from it, and you might realize later in your own work that something has influenced you, or that something that you were obsessed with is reflected in some way. But there's so much to explore. There's so much good stuff out there to learn from. Yes.
Since you mentioned Dickens, I was just reading this morning the piece you wrote for LitHub,
Mm-hmm.
and I think you're talking about the moment with your one of the first editors you
Yeah.
had.
Yeah.
And didn't she? I think
Yeah.
you told her you like Dickens, and she was like, "Oh, wait till you grow up
Yeah,
and you see what
yeah,
you
yeah.
like him." But I don't remember if you ever come back. But do you feel like that came true? Like, what is she referring to?
Oh yeah, so this piece, I wrote a little essay in LitHub about writing this book, and it's sort of about, I guess sort of the thesis of the essay is that when I was younger, I loved to write about older people, and now that I'm older, I'm more interested in writing about youth, or feel more capable of writing about youth. And I had this wonderful editor, yet again, another much, much older woman. I was 20 years old. I was at Harvard. She had a daughter at Harvard, and she was the managing editor at Commentary in New York. And she'd come to visit her daughter, Molly. And I think she must have just written off the trip by meeting with me. We'd meet at Au Bon Pen, and this is, of course, the days before the internet. Like, we would sit there with the galleys, which were long galleys, which she had marked up, and we would discuss my stories, which was like, and she would also discuss literature and art with me. And she said at one point, "It'll be interesting to see what kind of writer you turn out to be," because I was writing these very funny stories, which made her laugh. But she was sort of like, what else are you going to be? What else have you got? And I mean, I was super young. And she was like, will you sort of evolve, or will you turn out to be very satirical, like Dickens? And I was sort of looking at her going, what's wrong with Dickens? Like, I love Dickens. I was reading him. I read him obsessively since 5th grade, and she was sort of like, you'll see. I was like, what? Talking about? And at the time, I was sort of like, you expect me to be like Henry James? I was in a tutorial taught by a Henry James specialist, and at the time I was kind of pushing. I was not crazy about Henry James. Do you want me to be sort of mannered and introverted, and everything takes forever to happen? And, that was my take on it. She passed away on when I was pretty young, so she didn't get. I don't think she saw what I turned out to be. I think, and I'm still turning out. I think that one of the things I'm really interested in is doing all different kinds of work, and this book is very different from many of my other books. But they're all different from. I want to explore. I want, like a scientist, I want to research people. Except my subject is people, but I want to research individuals. And I want to explore and play with voice and point of view and different places and different worlds. So I always thought, sort of, why do you have to have this kind of linear progression where you turn into one person? Why not be many people? I think of writing more like acting. You take on a role, except you also write the script, and you create the theater, and you do the lighting, and you get to be the casting director, which is very important, because while casting directors in the theater cast a part to an actor, a writer casts an idea into a person. And I think that's one of the most creative parts of writing fiction. So yeah, it's a funny moment in the essay. But yeah, I don't think I turned out to be like Dickens. There's only one Dickens. We all live in our own time with our own experience, and one is enough. So. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much for coming. This was so much fun.